In the autumn of 1848, when construction workers began demolishing the abandoned St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, Massachusetts, they made a discovery that would haunt the town for generations. Hidden beneath the Academy's chapel floorboards, sealed in a lead-lined box, were 47 small leather journals, each bearing the name of a different girl. The pages contained detailed accounts of unspeakable horrors, but what terrified investigators most were the meticulously kept client records, listing names that read like a who's who of New England's political elite. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts immediately sealed the findings, claiming public safety concerns, and, to this day, those records remain classified in the state archives. What I'm about to tell you comes from testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day, documents that powerful families tried desperately to bury, and the dying confession of a woman who carried these secrets for 60 years. If you're someone who seeks the truth behind America's darkest secrets, someone who isn't afraid to peer into the shadows of our nation's past, then this story is for you. But I must warn you, what happened at St. Mary's Academy challenges everything we thought we knew about respectability, power, and innocence in 19th century New England. Before we descend into this abyss of human corruption, hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to uncover the mysteries that others dare not tell, and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this horror could have happened anywhere. Now let me take you back to a time when evil wore the mask of virtue. Salem, Massachusetts in 1811 was a city still haunted by its infamous past, yet determined to reinvent itself as a beacon of moral righteousness and educational progress. The witch trials of 1692 had left an indelible stain on the community's reputation, and by the early 19th century, Salem's leading families were desperately seeking ways to restore their town's standing in the eyes of New England society. It was into this atmosphere of redemption and reinvention that the Fairfax family arrived, carrying with them impeccable credentials and a vision that would captivate the town's elite. Victoria Fairfax was a woman of remarkable presence, tall, elegant, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to peer directly into one's soul. Born to a wealthy Virginia plantation family, she had received the finest education available to women of her station, studying literature and languages in Philadelphia before spending 2 years in London absorbing the latest educational philosophies. Her husband, Dr. Cornelius Fairfax, had died in a yellow fever outbreak in Charleston, leaving her widowed at 32 with a substantial inheritance and a burning desire to dedicate her life to the moral elevation of young womanhood. When Victoria announced her intention to establish the St. Mary's Academy for young ladies in Salem, the town's Congregationalist leadership embraced her vision with enthusiasm. Here was a woman of obvious refinement and Christian virtue, offering to provide free education to orphaned and impoverished girls, while also accepting paying students from respectable families. The academy would teach not only reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also music, French, needlework, and most importantly, moral instruction rooted in Protestant values. The building Victoria selected for her academy had a history as complicated as Salem itself. The imposing 3-story Georgian mansion on Beacon Hill had been constructed in 1787 by merchant Samuel Hartwell, who had made his fortune in the China trade. After Hartwell's death in 1809, the property had stood empty, its dark windows overlooking Salem Harbor like dead eyes. Local residents whispered that the house was cursed. 3 different families had attempted to live there, and each had fled within months, citing strange sounds and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down upon them like a physical weight. But Victoria Fairfax showed no fear of such superstitions. She purchased the property for a fraction of its assessed value and immediately began extensive renovations. Workmen added a chapel wing, complete with stained glass windows depicting scenes from the lives of female saints. They constructed dormitories that could house 30 girls, a dining hall that could seat 50, and most notably, a series of private chambers on the third floor that Victoria described as meditation rooms where students could reflect on their spiritual development in solitude. Joining Victoria in her noble endeavor were two family members who shared her passion for education and moral guidance. Evangeline Fairfax, Victoria's younger sister, was a delicate woman with prematurely grey hair and hands that trembled slightly when she spoke, a condition she attributed to a childhood fever. Despite her fragile appearance, Evangeline possessed a remarkable gift for music and languages, and she would serve as the Academy's primary instructor in these subjects. Her voice, when she sang hymns during chapel services, was said to be so beautiful that even the most hardened sailors would pause in their work to listen when the sound drifted down from the Academy's windows. The third member of the Fairfax triumvirate was Bartholomew Fairfax, Victoria's brother-in-law, and a man whose presence seemed to cast a shadow even in bright sunlight. Tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a voice that carried the authority of absolute conviction, Bartholomew had spent 15 years as a traveling preacher throughout the southern states before answering Victoria's call to serve as the Academy's chaplain. His sermons on the corruption of the modern world and the special vulnerability of young women to Satan's temptations were legendary throughout the region. Parents who heard him speak felt both terrified for their daughters' spiritual welfare and grateful that such a vigilant guardian would be watching over them at St. Mary's. The Academy officially opened its doors on September 15, 1811, with great fanfare. Salem's mayor attended the dedication ceremony, along with several state legislators and the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Victoria's opening address, delivered from the steps of the Academy as autumn leaves swirled around her black silk dress, spoke of creating a sanctuary of learning where young ladies could develop both intellectual accomplishment and moral strength, protected from the corrupting influences of a world increasingly driven by commerce and vice. The first students to enter St. Mary's Academy were a carefully selected group of 23 girls, ranging in age from 12 to 17. Some came from respectable Salem families who paid the substantial tuition of $50 per year, a sum that represented several months' wages for a working man. But Victoria's stated mission was to serve those less fortunate, and more than half of the initial enrollment consisted of orphans and daughters of impoverished families, accepted without charge as demonstrations of the Academy's Christian charity. Among these charity students was 14-year-old Margaret Sullivan, whose Irish immigrant parents had died in a tenement fire the previous winter. Margaret was a bright-spirited girl with red hair and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. She had been working in a textile mill for 6 months when a representative of the Academy approached her with an offer that seemed too good to be true: free room, board, and education in exchange for helping with domestic duties around the Academy. Another was 15-year-old Priscilla Morse, whose father had been lost at sea and whose mother had died of consumption, leaving her in the care of an uncle who made it clear that her presence was an unwelcome burden. Priscilla was quiet and serious, with dark hair that she wore in a severe bun, and a habit of reading any book she could find. The prospect of attending a real school, with access to a library and qualified teachers, seemed like an answered prayer. The third was 13-year-old Hannah Whitmore, perhaps the most tragic case of all. Hannah's father had been convicted of theft and sentenced to 5 years in prison, while her mother had simply disappeared one night, leaving behind only a note saying she could no longer bear the shame. Hannah had been living in the Salem poorhouse when Victoria Fairfax personally visited and offered her a place at the Academy. The girl's pale, hollow-cheeked face had brightened for the first time in months when she learned she would have her own bed, regular meals, and the chance to learn to read properly. These girls, along with their 20 classmates, entered St. Mary's Academy with hearts full of hope and gratitude. They had no way of knowing that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap, that the woman who promised to protect their virtue was about to steal their innocence, and that the elegant Georgian mansion overlooking Salem Harbor would become their prison, their nightmare. and for many of them, their tomb. The first hint that something was amiss at St. Mary's Academy came not from the students themselves, but from Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a seamstress who lived in a modest cottage at the base of Beacon Hill. Mrs. Thornton had been commissioned to provide linens and clothing for the academy, and her weekly deliveries gave her occasion to observe the daily routines of the institution from a distance. It was on a grey October morning in 1812, exactly 13 months after the academy's opening, that Mrs. Thornton first noticed something peculiar. She had arrived earlier than usual to deliver a shipment of winter cloaks, and was surprised to see several well-dressed gentlemen departing from the academy's side entrance, the same entrance that led directly to the private chambers on the 3rd floor. What struck her as odd was not merely their early morning departure, but their obvious efforts to avoid being seen. They moved quickly to waiting carriages, keeping their heads down and their hat brims low over their faces. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Thornton began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings at the academy. She noticed that these mysterious visitors always arrived after dark and always used the side entrance. Sometimes there would be only 1 or 2 carriages. Other nights, she counted as many as 6. The vehicles bore no identifying marks, but, even in the dim light of gas lamps, she could see they were expensive, the kind owned by merchants, politicians, or other men of substantial means. More disturbing still were the changes she observed in the students themselves. The girls who had entered the academy with bright faces and eager expressions were becoming increasingly withdrawn and hollow-eyed. During her deliveries, Mrs. Thornton would occasionally catch glimpses of them through windows, and what she saw troubled her deeply. Many appeared listless and moved with a strange dreamlike quality, as if they were walking through water. Some bore visible marks, bruises on their arms that were hastily concealed beneath long sleeves, cuts on their hands that were explained away as needlework accidents. The transformation was most noticeable in Margaret Sullivan, the spirited Irish girl who had once chatted excitedly about her studies whenever Mrs. Thornton encountered her. By winter, Margaret rarely spoke at all. Her vibrant red hair had become dull and lifeless, hanging in limp strands around a face that had grown gaunt and pale. When she did meet Mrs. Thornton's eyes, there was something desperate in her gaze, as if she were trying to communicate a message she dared not speak aloud. It was on the night of December 13th, 1812, that Mrs. Thornton witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Unable to sleep due to a persistent cough, she had risen from her bed around midnight to brew some chamomile tea. As she stood by her kitchen window, waiting for the water to boil, she noticed unusual activity at the academy. Light flickered in the 3rd floor windows, not the steady glow of candles or oil lamps, but an erratic dancing illumination that suggested torches or perhaps a small fire. At first she assumed someone was simply reading late or tending to a sick student, but then she heard sounds that made her blood run cold. Muffled screaming that seemed to come from the academy's chapel. The sounds were intermittent, lasting only a few seconds at a time, but they were unmistakably human and unmistakably expressions of agony or terror. Mrs. Thornton pressed her face against the cold window glass, straining to see more clearly. The chapel windows glowed with that same strange flickering light, and she could make out shadowy figures moving inside. The screaming continued sporadically for nearly an hour, punctuated by periods of silence that were somehow even more unsettling than the sounds themselves. When morning came, Mrs. Thornton convinced herself that she must have been mistaken, that her fever and exhaustion had caused her to imagine things. But when she made her next delivery to the academy 3 days later, she learned that one of the students, young Hannah Whitmore, had died suddenly during the night of December 13th. Victoria Fairfax, dressed in mourning clothes that somehow made her appear more imposing than grieving, explained that the girl had succumbed to a sudden fever despite the best efforts of the academy's physician. The funeral was held the following morning in the Academy's chapel, a small private service attended only by the faculty and students. Mrs. Thornton was not invited, but she could hear the hymns drifting down from the hill, sung in voices that seemed more fearful than mournful. Evangeline Fairfax's beautiful soprano rose above the others, but even her angelic voice could not mask the underlying note of desperation that seemed to permeate the entire performance. Hannah Whitmore was buried in the small cemetery behind the Academy, marked with a simple stone cross bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. No family members attended the service because she had no family left, a fact that Victoria Fairfax noted with what might have been satisfaction rather than sorrow. In the weeks that followed Hannah's death, Mrs. Thornton noticed that several other students seemed to be ailing. They moved more slowly, spoke even less frequently, and displayed the same listless behavior that had characterized Hannah in her final days. When she discreetly inquired about their health, Victoria Fairfax assured her that the girls were simply experiencing the normal effects of intensive academic study combined with the moral discipline necessary for their spiritual development. Young ladies of their unfortunate backgrounds, Victoria explained in her crisp, cultured voice, often require significant adjustment before they can fully embrace the refined way of life we provide here. Some find the transition more challenging than others, but Mrs. Thornton's suspicions were not so easily dismissed. She began to take careful note of which students appeared to be struggling, and she noticed a disturbing pattern. The girls who seemed most affected were invariably among the poorest, those who had no families to inquire about their welfare or financial resources to leave the academy if they chose. The paying students, while certainly more subdued than when they had first arrived, maintained better color in their cheeks and greater alertness in their eyes. The pattern became impossible to ignore when, in February of 1813, 2 more students died within a single week. Priscilla Morse, the quiet girl who had loved to read, was found dead in her bed on a Tuesday morning, apparently having passed away peacefully in her sleep. 3 days later, Mary Catherine O'Brien, another Irish orphan, succumbed to what was described as brain fever after a brief illness characterized by violent convulsions. Both girls were buried in the Academy Cemetery with the same simple ceremony that had marked Hannah's passing. Their deaths were reported to the town authorities. But since Dr. Fairfax's cousin, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, served as both the Academy's physician and the official coroner for that district, the deaths were officially attributed to natural causes, without further investigation. Mrs. Thornton found herself torn between her growing suspicions and her awareness that she was just a simple seamstress with no evidence beyond her own observations. Who would believe her if she suggested that something sinister was happening at Salem's most prestigious academy for young ladies? Victoria Fairfax was respected throughout the community, praised for her charitable work and her dedication to education. The academy received regular visits from local clergy and civic leaders, all of whom spoke glowingly of the institution's mission and achievements. Yet she could not shake the image of those flickering lights in the chapel windows or the memory of those muffled screams echoing through the December night. Something terrible was happening on Beacon Hill, something that the respectable facade of St. Mary's Academy was designed to conceal. But it would be years before the truth began to emerge, and when it did, the reality would prove to be far more horrific than even Mrs. Thornton's darkest suspicions had imagined. By the spring of 1813, a strange quietude had settled over St. Mary's Academy for young ladies, as if the very walls had absorbed the sorrow and secrets within them, and now emanated an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even ordinary sounds. The death of 3 students within 4 months had cast a pall over the institution. Yet life continued with a routine that suggested these losses were merely unfortunate interruptions in the Academy's noble mission rather than symptoms of something far more sinister. Victoria Fairfax adapted to these tragedies with what observers noted as remarkable composure. Rather than allowing grief to overwhelm her, she seemed to draw strength from adversity, speaking frequently about the spiritual trials that God sent to test the faithful and the importance of viewing earthly suffering as preparation for heavenly reward. Her sermons to the remaining students took on an increasingly intense quality, dwelling on themes of sacrifice, submission, and the necessity of absolute obedience to those whom God had placed in authority over them. "Young ladies," she would intone from the chapel pulpit, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across the assembled students like a blade cutting through silk, "you must understand that your previous lives, lives of poverty, abandonment, and moral confusion, have left marks upon your souls that can only be cleansed through the most rigorous spiritual discipline. The path to redemption is not easy, and some among you may not possess the strength necessary to complete the journey. But for those who do, the rewards will be beyond earthly comprehension." The surviving students had learned to listen to these addresses with carefully composed expressions that revealed nothing of their inner thoughts. They had learned, through means both subtle and overt, that displays of emotion or independent thinking were not welcomed at St. Mary's Academy. Those who asked too many questions or showed too much curiosity about the Academy's operations found themselves assigned to increasingly unpleasant duties, scrubbing floors with lye soap that burned their hands, working in the Academy's garden during the hottest part of summer days, or spending long hours alone in the meditation rooms on the third floor, contemplating their sins and shortcomings. Margaret Sullivan, now 15 and barely recognizable as the spirited girl who had entered the Academy 18 months earlier, had become a master of this emotional concealment. She moved through her daily routines like a ghost, haunting familiar halls, speaking only when spoken to and keeping her thoughts locked away behind eyes that had learned to reveal nothing. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Margaret's mind remained sharp and observant. She had begun to notice patterns in the Academy's routines that troubled her deeply. She had observed, for instance, that certain students were periodically selected for what Evangeline Fairfax called special instruction in the third-floor chambers. These sessions always took place in the evening, after regular classes had ended and the Academy had settled into its nightly quiet. The girls chosen for such instruction would disappear upstairs immediately after dinner, often remaining there until well past midnight. When they returned to the dormitory, they moved with the same dreamlike quality that had characterized Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine in their final weeks. More disturbing still was Margaret's growing awareness that these special instruction sessions coincided with the visits of the mysterious gentlemen who arrived in unmarked carriages. Through careful observation, she had determined that the side entrance to the Academy, the one that led directly to the third-floor chambers, was used exclusively during these nocturnal meetings. During daylight hours, all visitors used the main entrance and were received in the Academy's formal parlor, where their business was conducted with appropriate supervision and ceremony. Margaret had also noticed that students who participated in multiple special instruction sessions began to display physical symptoms that went beyond mere fatigue. They would sit quietly during meals, picking at their food with little appetite, and many complained of persistent headaches and stomach ailments. Some developed a slight tremor in their hands that was remarkably similar to Evangeline Fairfax's own nervous condition. When questioned about these symptoms, Dr. Edmund Fairfax would diagnose them as manifestations of spiritual sensitivity, evidence that the girls' souls were becoming more receptive to divine influence as their earthly attachments were gradually purged away. The Academy's routine during this period was rigidly structured, designed to eliminate any opportunity for the students to communicate freely among themselves or to develop relationships that might encourage independent thinking. The day began at 5 o'clock with chapel service, followed by a sparse breakfast of weak tea and bread. Classes ran from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with only a brief break for a midday meal of thin soup and more bread. Evenings were devoted to moral instruction, lengthy sessions in which Bartholomew Fairfax would read from specially selected religious texts, while the students sat in absolute silence, forbidden from asking questions or making comments. This schedule left the girls exhausted and isolated, unable to form the bonds of friendship that might have provided comfort or strength in the face of their increasingly dire circumstances. Those who attempted to communicate through whispered conversations or passed notes found themselves subjected to severe punishments that effectively discouraged further attempts at connection. Yet despite these precautions, information began to spread among the students through a network of subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and carefully coded conversations that took place during supervised activities. Margaret Sullivan emerged as an unofficial leader in this underground communication system, using her position as one of the Academy's longest surviving students to gather and disseminate information about the institution's true nature. Through these covert channels, Margaret learned that the special instruction sessions involved more than religious education. Girls who had undergone these experiences described being given strange-tasting tea that made them feel dizzy and disoriented, followed by activities that they found difficult to remember clearly afterward. Some recalled being dressed in unusual clothing, white gowns that resembled burial shrouds rather than normal garments. Others remembered being required to participate in ceremonies that involved candles, incense, and recited prayers in languages they did not recognize. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of the gentlemen who attended these sessions. The girls described men of various ages, all well-dressed and clearly prosperous, who spoke with the accents of education and refinement, but whose eyes held an hunger that made the students instinctively afraid. These men would observe the ceremonies from chairs arranged around the perimeter of the third-floor chambers, sometimes participating in the prayers and rituals, but always maintaining an air of detached authority that suggested they were not merely observers but active participants in whatever was taking place. As winter gave way to spring in 1813, Margaret began to understand that she and her fellow students were trapped in a situation far more dangerous than simple educational fraud or religious fanaticism. They were prisoners in an institution that presented itself as a sanctuary of learning and moral development, but functioned as something far more sinister, something that required the systematic destruction of young women's spirits and, ultimately, their lives. The realization filled her with a mixture of terror and determination that surprised her with its intensity. She had survived longer than Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine, but she could see the same symptoms beginning to manifest in herself and others. The trembling hands, the persistent fatigue, the growing difficulty in concentrating on even, simple tasks, all suggested that whatever process had claimed the lives of her friends was now claiming her as well. But Margaret Sullivan had not endured 2 years of poverty, abandonment, and suffering, only to surrender without a fight. As the spring of 1813 progressed, she began to formulate a desperate plan, a plan that would either secure her freedom or ensure that the truth about St. Mary's Academy would not die with her. The Academy's carefully constructed facade of respectability was about to face its first serious challenge, though it would take years for the full extent of the Fairfax family's crimes to be revealed to the world. The opportunity Margaret Sullivan had been waiting for came in the form of Miss Constance Hartwell, a young woman whose arrival at St. Mary's Academy in September of 1813 would prove to be the catalyst for events that Victoria Fairfax could never have anticipated. Miss Hartwell was not a student, but a new instructor hired to teach mathematics and natural philosophy to the Academy's more advanced pupils. Her presence represented a significant departure from the Fairfax family's previous practice of keeping all educational duties within their immediate circle. Constance Hartwell was 24 years old, the daughter of a prosperous Boston merchant, who had provided her with an education that was remarkable for its breadth and rigor. She had studied at Miss Willard's Female Seminary in Troy, New York, where she had been exposed to progressive ideas about women's education and intellectual capabilities. Unlike the subdued, carefully controlled atmosphere that characterized St. Mary's Academy, Miss Willard's institution had encouraged critical thinking, independent research, and open discussion of complex ideas. Miss Hartwell had accepted the position at St. Mary's for reasons both practical and idealistic. The salary offered by Victoria Fairfax was generous, more than she could earn at any other educational institution in New England, and the opportunity to work with disadvantaged girls appealed to her strong sense of social responsibility. Her father had initially opposed her decision to work at all, believing that a woman of her social standing should focus on finding a suitable husband rather than pursuing a career. But Constance had inherited her father's stubborn determination along with his sharp intellect, and she had convinced him that teaching would provide valuable experience in managing people and resources that would serve her well regardless of what path her life ultimately took. From her first day at the academy, Constance noticed inconsistencies that troubled her analytical mind. The students she had been assigned to teach were clearly intelligent, but they displayed a curious passivity that seemed at odds with their obvious capabilities. When she asked questions designed to stimulate discussion and critical thinking, she was met with blank stares and mechanical recitations of facts that suggested rote memorization rather than genuine understanding. More puzzling still was the students' apparent fear of expressing opinions or asking questions of their own. In her previous teaching experience, Constance had found that young women, when given permission to think freely, were naturally curious and eager to explore new ideas. But the girls at St. Mary's Academy seemed to have had all intellectual curiosity systematically suppressed, as if independent thought itself had been identified as a dangerous tendency that needed to be eliminated. During her first weeks at the academy, Constance attributed these observations to the rigorous religious discipline that clearly dominated the institution's culture. She had been raised in a devoutly Congregationalist household and understood the value of moral instruction and spiritual development. But as the autumn progressed, she began to suspect that something beyond ordinary religious education was responsible for the students' unusual behavior. The first concrete evidence of this came during a mathematics lesson in October, when she noticed that one of her brightest students, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Pemberton, was having difficulty concentrating on relatively simple arithmetic problems. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked, and she frequently lost track of her calculations midway through solving them. When Constance gently inquired about her difficulties, Sarah's response was both revealing and disturbing. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously toward the classroom door as if afraid of being overheard. "Sometimes my mind feels cloudy, like there's a fog inside my head that makes it hard to think clearly. Dr. Fairfax says it's because my spirit is being purified, but I remember being able to think more clearly before I came here." This conversation planted the first seeds of serious concern in Constance's mind. She began to pay closer attention to the physical condition of her students, and what she observed alarmed her. Many displayed symptoms that reminded her of patients she had seen during a cholera outbreak in Boston the previous year. Not the specific symptoms of that disease, but the same general appearance of systemic poisoning. They were pale, listless, and frequently complained of headaches and stomach ailments. Several had developed the same tremor that affected Evangeline Fairfax, and most showed signs of significant weight loss, despite the Academy's claims that they were receiving adequate nutrition. Constance's growing suspicions were confirmed when she discovered that her access to certain areas of the academy was strictly limited. She had been assigned quarters on the second floor, but the third floor was declared off-limits to all faculty except members of the Fairfax family. When she innocently inquired about using one of the third-floor rooms for private tutoring sessions, Victoria Fairfax's reaction was swift and decisive. "Miss Hartwell," Victoria said, her steel-grey eyes fixing Constance with an intensity that was both compelling and unsettling. "I'm sure you understand that an institution like ours must maintain certain boundaries and protocols. The third floor contains meditation chambers that are reserved for students undergoing advanced spiritual instruction. The atmosphere there is consecrated, you might say, and we cannot risk contaminating it with secular activities, no matter how well-intentioned." The firmness of this prohibition, combined with Victoria's obvious discomfort at having the subject raised, convinced Constance that the third floor held secrets that the Fairfax family was determined to protect. She began to observe the academy's nighttime routines more carefully, noting the patterns of activity that Mrs. Thornton had witnessed from her cottage, but which were invisible to most residents of the academy itself. It was during one of these covert observations that Constance first encountered Margaret Sullivan in circumstances that would forge an alliance between them. On a November evening, when rain drummed against the academy's windows and wind howled around its corners, Constance was returning from the library when she noticed a figure moving stealthily through the corridor that led to the side entrance. The figure was clearly one of the students, but she was not dressed in the standard grey wool dress that served as the academy's uniform. Instead, she wore a white gown that seemed to glow in the dim light of the corridor's oil lamps. Constance followed at a distance, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that covered the hallway floors. She watched as the figure, whom she now recognized as Margaret Sullivan, approached the side entrance and pressed her ear against the door. Margaret remained in this position for several minutes, clearly listening to something happening on the other side, before turning and retracing her steps. When Margaret spotted Constance in the shadows, both young women froze, uncertain how to proceed. The moment stretched between them, fraught with mutual recognition that they had both been engaged in activities that would be severely punished if discovered. Finally, Margaret stepped forward, her green eyes meeting Constance's with an intensity that conveyed both desperation and determination. "Miss Hartwell," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. "I need to speak with you, but not here and not now. Tomorrow, during your mathematics class, ask me to stay after to discuss my work. I have things to tell you that you need to know." The following day's mathematics lesson passed with agonizing slowness, but finally the other students were dismissed and Margaret remained behind as arranged. What she told Constance during the next hour would shatter the young teacher's assumptions about St. Mary's Academy and launch both women on a desperate quest for evidence that could expose the truth about the Fairfax family's crimes. Margaret's account was both detailed and horrifying. She described the special instruction sessions in clinical terms that suggested she had been observing and analyzing the academy's operations with the systematic approach of a trained investigator. She explained the pattern of student deaths, the mysterious nighttime visitors, and the growing evidence that the girls were being systematically poisoned with substances that clouded their minds and weakened their bodies. Most shocking of all was Margaret's theory about the true purpose of the academy. Based on overheard conversations, observed behaviors, and the accounts of students who had undergone special instruction, she believed that St. Mary's Academy was not an educational institution at all, but rather an elaborate procurement operation designed to provide young women for the entertainment of wealthy and powerful men. The education and religious instruction were merely facades designed to maintain the academy's reputation, while the real business was conducted in the third floor, chambers under cover of darkness. "They're not just killing us, Miss Hartwell," Margaret concluded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "They're destroying us first, our minds, our will, our ability to resist or escape. And then, when we're too weak to fight anymore, they use us until we die." Hannah, Priscilla, Mary, Catherine, they didn't die of fever or brain sickness. They were murdered, as surely as if someone had put a knife through their hearts. Constance listened to this account with growing horror and a sick certainty that Margaret's analysis was correct. Too many pieces of the puzzle fit together too, perfectly for this to be the product of an overwrought imagination. The trembling hands, the clouded minds, the mysterious visitors, the rigid control over information and movement, all of it pointed to a conspiracy of almost unimaginable evil. But even as she accepted the truth of Margaret's revelations, Constance understood the enormity of the challenge they faced. The Fairfax family was respected throughout Salem and beyond. Victoria was considered a pillar of Christian virtue. Evangeline was beloved for her musical talents and gentle demeanor, and Bartholomew's reputation as a powerful preacher had earned him admirers throughout New England. Accusations against such people, made by a working-class seamstress and a charity student, would be dismissed as slander born of jealousy or mental instability. They would need evidence, concrete, undeniable, proof of the crimes being committed at St. Mary's Academy, and they would need to obtain this evidence without alerting the Fairfax family to their suspicions, because both women understood that discovery would mean certain death. The Academy had already demonstrated its ability to eliminate inconvenient witnesses while maintaining its facade of respectability. As winter settled over Salem in 1813, two women began a dangerous game of cat and mouse with their captors, seeking the proof that could save the surviving students and expose one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. But they were not the hunters in this game. They were the prey, and their quarry possessed resources, connections, and ruthlessness that neither of them fully comprehended. The winter of 1813-1814 transformed St. Mary's Academy into a battleground, where two desperate women fought for evidence while their enemies closed in around them with increasing suspicion and hostility. Constance Hartwell and Margaret Sullivan had formed an unlikely alliance, an educated young woman from Boston's merchant class, and an Irish orphan who had learned survival through suffering. But their different backgrounds proved to be an advantage, as they developed a sophisticated intelligence operation within the Academy's walls. Their first breakthrough came through Constance's legitimate access to the Academy's administrative areas. As an instructor, she was permitted to use Victoria, Fairfax's office, during certain hours to prepare lesson plans and grade assignments. During these sessions, she began to systematically examine the files and documents that Victoria kept in her locked desk. A task made possible by Margaret's childhood skills at picking locks, learned during her desperate months on Salem's streets. Before entering the Academy, what they discovered exceeded their worst fears. Hidden beneath conventional academic records and correspondence were detailed ledgers that recorded financial transactions unlike anything a legitimate educational institution would maintain. The entries were written in a coded system, but the pattern became clear once they understood the underlying structure. Each student was assigned a number, and their progress was tracked through a series of evaluations that had nothing to do with academic achievement. Margaret's blood ran cold when she found her own entry. Subject 12. MS, red-green, 15 years, conditioning progressing slowly. Resistance above average. Recommend increased dosage and extended isolation periods. Client interest, moderate but consistent. Estimated transition to final phase, 3 to 4 months. The clinical detachment of these notes was perhaps more horrifying than outright cruelty would have been. The girls were not seen as human beings, but as inventory, tracked and managed with the same dispassionate efficiency that a merchant might use to catalog bolts of cloth or barrels of flour. Worse still, the ledgers contained client preferences that read like a catalogue of human depravity. Certain men preferred younger girls, others specified physical characteristics, and some had requested particular temperaments: shy, defiant, or what was euphemistically described as broken. But the most damning evidence came in the form of correspondence between Victoria Fairfax and her clients. These letters, written in Victoria's elegant handwriting, discussed arrangements with a frankness that left no doubt about the Academy's true purpose. One letter, dated November 15, 1813, addressed to someone identified only as the Honourable J.A., contained details that made both women feel physically ill. "My dear friend, I am pleased to inform you that the young lady you inquired about has made significant progress in her preparation. The temperament issues you mentioned have been largely resolved through our specialized instruction methods, and I believe she will meet your exacting standards within the fortnight. As always, our mutual discretion ensures that your association with our institution remains entirely confidential. Your usual contribution of $200 will be most gratefully received." The systematic nature of the operation became clear as they uncovered more documents. The Academy served as a procurement and conditioning center for a network of wealthy clients throughout New England and beyond. The girls were not simply exploited. They were systematically broken down through a combination of drugs, psychological manipulation, and physical abuse until they became compliant victims who could be rented to clients or sold outright to those willing to pay premium prices. The death of students like Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary Catherine was not accidental, but part of the business model. Girls who proved too resistant to conditioning, who became too ill to be profitable, or who posed security risks, were eliminated with carefully administered overdoses of laudanum and other substances. Their deaths were then attributed to natural causes, with Dr. Edmund Fairfax providing the necessary medical certifications to avoid official investigation. As Constance and Margaret gathered this evidence, they became increasingly aware that their own activities were being monitored. Victoria Fairfax had always been observant, but her scrutiny of Constance's behavior became more intense and pointed. During faculty meetings, Victoria would ask seemingly innocent questions about Constance's lesson plans, her interactions with students, and her impressions of the Academy's educational methods. But beneath the polite inquiry, Constance could sense a predatory intelligence evaluating her responses for signs of suspicion or disloyalty. The pressure increased dramatically in January of 1814, when another student died under circumstances that could no longer be dismissed as coincidental. Elizabeth Morrison, a 14-year-old from a poor farming family, had been at the Academy for only 4 months when she was found dead in her bed on a Tuesday morning. Unlike the previous deaths, which had been attributed to fever or brain sickness, Elizabeth showed no signs of illness before her death. She had simply failed to wake up, as if her life had been quietly extinguished during the night. Dr. Edmund Fairfax's examination of the body was perfunctory, lasting less than 10 minutes before he declared the cause of death to be heart failure brought on by spiritual excitement. But Constance, who had observed Elizabeth closely during her mathematics classes, knew that the girl had shown no signs of heart problems. She had been pale and listless like the others, but she had also been one of the more alert students, still capable of asking intelligent questions and demonstrating genuine interest in her studies. More troubling still was the timing of Elizabeth's death. Margaret had confided to Constance that Elizabeth had been selected for special instruction on 3 consecutive evenings before her death, and that she had seemed particularly distressed after these sessions. According to other students, Elizabeth had been heard crying in her sleep and had spoken of wanting to write a letter to her parents, a request that had been firmly denied by Evangeline Fairfax on the grounds that contact with family members would interfere with the spiritual development process. The night after Elizabeth's funeral, Constance made a decision that would either provide them with the evidence they needed or result in their own deaths. She resolved to infiltrate one of the special instruction sessions and witness firsthand what was happening in the 3rd-floor chambers. It was an enormous risk, but she had concluded that they would never gather sufficient evidence through document analysis alone. They needed to see the crimes being committed with their own eyes. Margaret initially opposed this plan, arguing that the risk was too great and that Constance's discovery would doom them both. But Constance had inherited her father's determination along with his business acumen, and she had become convinced that half measures would not suffice. If they were going to expose the Fairfax family's crimes, they needed evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away by clever lawyers and corrupt officials. The opportunity came on February 8, 1814, a night when the third-floor chambers was scheduled to host what the coded ledgers described as a large gathering with multiple clients. Margaret had learned through her network of student informants that 6 girls had been selected for this session, including herself and 2 other long-term residents of the academy. The session was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock in the evening, after the regular students had been secured in the dormitory and the academy had settled into its nightly routine. Constance's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would conceal herself in one of the storage closets on the 3rd floor before the evening session began, then observe the proceedings through a small ventilation grate that provided a clear view of the main chamber. Margaret would participate in the session as required, but she would attempt to remain as alert as possible despite whatever drugs she was given, so that she could provide detailed testimony about anything Constance might not be able to see clearly. The plan required precise timing and considerable luck. Constance needed to reach the 3rd floor and conceal herself before the Fairfax family began their preparations, but she also needed to ensure that her absence from her regular evening routine would not be noticed. She solved this problem by claiming to be suffering from a severe headache that required her to retire early to her chamber, where she planned to spend the evening reading and preparing lessons for the following day. At 8:30, while the academy settled into its evening quiet, Constance slipped out of her room and made her way to the servants' staircase that provided access to the 3rd floor. The stairs creaked ominously under her weight, each sound seeming to echo through the building like a gunshot. She paused at every step, listening for signs that she had been detected, before continuing her careful ascent. The 3rd floor was dimly lit by oil lamps, placed at intervals along the corridor. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of incense and something else. A sweet, cloying odor that reminded Constance of the laudanum she had once been given during a dental procedure. The walls were lined with religious paintings depicting scenes of martyrdom and suffering, their dark colors and graphic imagery creating an atmosphere of oppression and doom. Constance located the storage closet she had identified during her reconnaissance and carefully opened its door. Inside, she found cleaning supplies, extra linens, and most importantly, a wooden crate that she could use as a platform to reach the ventilation grate near the ceiling. She positioned herself carefully, ensuring that she could see into the main chamber while remaining hidden in the shadows. At exactly 9 o'clock, she heard footsteps in the corridor and the sound of multiple voices speaking in low, urgent tones. Through the grate, she watched as Evangeline Fairfax entered the chamber, carrying a silver tray laden with delicate china cups. Behind her came Bartholomew Fairfax, dressed in ceremonial robes that transformed his already imposing figure into something that seemed to have stepped out of a medieval nightmare. But it was Victoria Fairfax who commanded the room when she entered, her presence filling the space with an authority that was both magnetic and terrifying. She had exchanged her usual black dress for an elaborate gown of deep purple silk, adorned with symbols that Constance did not recognize, but which seemed to pulse with malevolent significance in the flickering lamplight. The chamber itself had been transformed from whatever purpose it normally served into something that resembled a twisted parody of a church sanctuary. Candles burned in elaborate candelabras placed around the perimeter of the room, their flames casting dancing shadows on walls hung with tapestries depicting scenes that made Constance's stomach churn. At the center of the room was a raised platform, covered with white silk, surrounded by chairs arranged in a precise circle. As Constance watched in growing horror, the 6 selected students were led into the chamber. Margaret was among them, along with Sarah Pemberton and 4 other girls whose names Constance knew from her classroom rosters. All were dressed in the same white gowns that Margaret had worn during her earlier reconnaissance, and all moved with the dreamlike quality that suggested they had already been drugged. But the true horror began when the clients arrived. Through the side entrance came 6 men, all well-dressed and clearly prosperous, their faces bearing the confident expressions of individuals accustomed to having their desires satisfied, regardless of the cost to others. Constance recognized at least 3 of them: a prominent Salem merchant, a state legislator from Boston, and a judge whose reputation for moral rectitude had earned him praise throughout New England. What she witnessed during the next 2 hours would haunt her for the rest of her life. The special instruction was revealed to be an elaborate ritual of exploitation and abuse, conducted with ceremonial precision that somehow made it even more horrifying than random violence would have been. The drug students were manipulated and violated, while the clients observed and participated, their actions guided by Bartholomew Fairfax's liturgical directions and accompanied by Evangeline's haunting musical performances. Victoria Fairfax orchestrated the entire proceeding with the efficiency of a theatrical director, ensuring that each client's preferences were satisfied while maintaining the religious facade that seemed to provide psychological cover for the participants. The girls were treated not as human beings, but as sacred objects in a blasphemous ceremony, their suffering transformed into something that the participants could interpret as spiritual rather than criminal. When the session finally ended and the clients departed through the side entrance, Constance remained hidden in her closet for another hour, too shaken to move and afraid that any sound might betray her presence. She had obtained the evidence she needed, but she had also learned something that filled her with despair. The scope and sophistication of the Fairfax operation made it clear that challenging them would require resources and connections that she and Margaret simply did not possess. The network of powerful men who patronized St. Mary's Academy included judges, legislators, merchants, and clergy. Individuals with the authority to suppress investigations, discredit witnesses, and ensure that any accusations against the Fairfax family would be dismissed as the fantasies of unstable women. Even if Constance and Margaret managed to escape the academy and reach the authorities, they would be pitting their word against some of the most respected men in New England. As she finally crept back to her chamber in the early morning hours, Constance understood that they faced a choice between certain death if they remained silent and probable death if they attempted to expose the truth. But they also carried with them the knowledge that dozens of other girls would suffer and die if the academy continued its operations unchallenged. The game of cat and mouse had entered its final phase, and the stakes could not be higher. In the days that followed, both women would need to summon reserves of courage and cunning they did not know they possessed, because their enemies had begun to suspect that their secrets were no longer safe. The end began on February 14th, 1814, a date that would forever be seared into Constance Hartwell's memory, not as St. Valentine's Day, but as the morning when Victoria Fairfax's mask finally slipped completely away. Constance awoke to find a note slipped under her door, written in Victoria's elegant script. "Miss Hartwell, please join me in my office immediately after morning chapel. We have urgent matters to discuss regarding your future at this institution. 1DI." Tone was superficially polite, but Constance recognized the underlying threat. Something had alerted Victoria to her nocturnal activities, and this meeting would likely determine whether she lived to see another sunset. As she dressed with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm, Constance wondered if Margaret had also received a similar summons, or if her young accomplice had already been silenced during the night. Chapel service that morning was a study in barely controlled tension. Victoria conducted the proceedings with her usual commanding presence, but Constance noticed subtle signs of agitation, a slight tremor in her voice when she read from scripture, a tendency to grip the pulpit with unusual force, and most tellingly, the way her steel-grey eyes kept returning to scan the assembled students as if conducting an inventory. Margaret was present among the other girls, but she appeared more heavily drugged than usual. Her green eyes, normally sharp with intelligence even when clouded by laudanum, seemed almost vacant, and she swayed slightly as she stood during the hymns. When their gazes met briefly across the chapel, Margaret's expression conveyed a message that chilled Constance to the bone. She knew they had been discovered, and she was resigned to whatever fate awaited them. After chapel, Constance made her way to Victoria's office, with steps that felt like a condemned prisoner's walk to the gallows. She found Victoria seated behind her mahogany desk, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of benevolent educator. The woman who looked up at Constance's entrance was a predator who had finally cornered her prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. "Please, sit down, Miss Hartwell," Victoria said, her voice carrying the silky menace of a blade wrapped in velvet. "We have a great deal to discuss." Constance took the indicated chair, fighting to keep her expression neutral, despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing explanations and denials, but faced with Victoria's knowing gaze, she understood that deception was futile. "I trust you found your recent evening explorations educational," Victoria continued, opening a leather-bound folder that Constance recognized with a sinking heart. It contained detailed sketches of the third-floor layout, copies of coded ledger entries, and most damning of all, several pages covered with Constance's own handwriting, notes she had made while analyzing the evidence she and Margaret had gathered. The folder represented weeks of careful investigation, but it also represented a catastrophic security breach that Victoria could not have discovered through ordinary surveillance. Someone had betrayed them. Someone who had access to Constance's private papers and knowledge of their activities. "You seem surprised," Victoria observed, noting Constance's shock. "Did you really believe that your amateur espionage could escape notice in an institution where information is our most valuable commodity?" "My dear Miss Hartwell, we have been monitoring your activities since your third week here. Every document you examined, every conversation you held with students, every midnight excursion, all of it has been carefully observed and recorded." The revelation hit Constance like a physical blow. If Victoria had known about their investigation from the beginning, then everything they had discovered had been permitted, even orchestrated. The evidence they thought they had stolen had been deliberately left for them to find. The question was why. Victoria seemed to read her thoughts. "You're wondering why we allowed you to continue your little investigation when we could have eliminated you at any time. The answer is quite simple. You were useful to us. Your presence provided an excellent test of our security procedures and helped us identify weaknesses in our operational protocols. More importantly, your activities helped us locate a potential problem that had been developing among certain students." As if summoned by these words, Bartholomew Fairfax entered the office, his gaunt frame blocking the doorway like a spectre of death. Behind him came two men Constance had never seen before, large, roughly dressed individuals whose presence suggested that the Academy employed resources beyond the Fairfax family members. "Miss Sullivan has been most cooperative in explaining the extent of your conspiracy," Bartholomew announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator who had successfully run his quarry to ground. "She provided us with detailed information about your methods, your discoveries, and most importantly, your plans for exposing our operations to the authorities." The betrayal cut deeper than Constance had thought possible. Margaret, the brave girl who had risked everything to gather evidence against their captors, had apparently broken under pressure and revealed their secrets. But even as this realization threatened to crush her spirit. Constance noticed something in Bartholomew's eyes that suggested the situation might be more complex than it appeared. Victoria rose from her desk and moved to stand directly in front of Constance, her imposing presence filling the young woman's field of vision. "The question now, Miss Hartwell, is what to do with you. Your father is a prominent merchant with connections throughout Boston's business community. Your disappearance would be noticed and investigated in ways that would be inconvenient for our operations. However, your continued existence poses risks that we cannot tolerate. There is, however, a third option," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a seductive quality that was somehow more terrifying than outright threats. "You could join us willingly. Your education and social connections would make you a valuable addition to our organization. We have operations in other cities that require sophisticated management, and your talents would be well compensated in positions of real authority." The offer was presented as a genuine choice, but Constance understood the underlying reality. Acceptance would mean becoming complicit in the systematic destruction of young lives. Refusal would mean death, probably disguised as an accident or sudden illness that would generate sympathy rather than suspicion. There was no third alternative, at least none that Victoria was willing to acknowledge. As Constance struggled to formulate a response that might buy her more time, commotion erupted in the corridor outside Victoria's office. Shouts echoed through the building, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps and doors being thrown open. Victoria's expression shifted from predatory satisfaction to confusion, and then to something approaching fear. The office door burst open to admit a group of men wearing the blue uniforms of the Massachusetts State Constabulary, led by a tall, stern-faced officer whose presence immediately transformed the dynamics in the room. Behind the constables came a figure that made Constance's heart leap with impossible hope. Margaret Sullivan, her green eyes blazing with fierce determination, and very much alive. "Victoria Fairfax," the lead constable announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. Bartholomew Fairfax and Evangeline Fairfax, you are also under arrest on the same charges. Gentlemen," he addressed the two rough men, "you will remain here for questioning." Victoria's composure cracked completely for the first time since Constance had known her. "This is preposterous," she declared, her voice rising to a near shriek. "These officers have no authority here. This is a private educational institution operating under proper charter from the Commonwealth." But the constable was unmoved by her protests. "Ma'am, we have sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, documentary evidence of criminal conspiracy, and eyewitness accounts of crimes committed on these premises. You will come with us now, peacefully, or we will use whatever force is necessary to compel your compliance." As the constables moved to place the Fairfax family members in custody, Margaret approached Constance with an expression that mixed triumph with exhaustion. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you," she whispered urgently. "When they confronted me 2 days ago, I realized it was our only chance. They thought I was broken, that I would betray everything to save myself. Instead, I told them exactly what they wanted to hear, while I found a way to get word to the authorities." The plan that Margaret had executed was breathtaking in its audacity and desperation. When confronted by Bartholomew about her activities, she had indeed confessed everything, but she had also convinced him that her cooperation was motivated by fear, and that she would do anything to avoid punishment. Using this facade of compliance, she had gained access to parts of the academy normally forbidden to students, including the side entrance that connected to the outside world. During the early morning hours, while her captors believed her to be securely drugged and confined, Margaret had slipped out of the academy and made her way to the Salem Constabulary Station. Her account of the crimes being committed at St. Mary's Academy had initially been met with skepticism, but her detailed knowledge of names, dates, and financial transactions had convinced the authorities to launch an immediate investigation. More, Importantly, Margaret had been able to provide the constables with a list of prominent clients who were scheduled to visit the academy that very evening. A list that included several judges and legislators whose corruption could not be hidden. If they were arrested in the act of exploiting drugged children, the prospect of exposing such a scandal had galvanized the authorities into action, overcoming their usual reluctance to challenge respected institutions and prominent citizens. As the Fairfax family was led away in chains, their carefully constructed empire of exploitation began to crumble with shocking rapidity. Within hours, constables had arrested Dr. Edmund Fairfax at his private practice, while other officers moved to secure the academy's records and interview the surviving students. The network of powerful men who had patronized the academy found themselves facing exposure and disgrace as their names appeared in the seized documents and testimony from witnesses who could no longer be silenced. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the seamstress whose early suspicions had been dismissed as the fantasies of a working-class woman with no understanding of how respectable institutions operated. When investigators interviewed her, they discovered that she had been keeping detailed records of her observations for more than 2 years, documenting the mysterious nighttime visitors, the strange lights in the chapel windows, and the gradual deterioration of the students she had observed during her deliveries. Her testimony provided crucial corroboration for the accounts given by Margaret and Constance, transforming their accusations from the word of biased witnesses to part of a comprehensive pattern of evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. The woman who had been ignored because of her social status became the key witness, whose observations anchored the prosecution's case. The trial of the Fairfax family would become one of the most sensational legal proceedings in Massachusetts history, exposing corruption that reached to the highest levels of New England society and revealing the vulnerability of the poor and powerless to exploitation by those who presented themselves as pillars of moral virtue. But the full scope of their crimes would not be understood until investigators had time to analyze the complete documentary record and interview all of the survivors who were willing to speak. The complete investigation of St. Mary's Academy took nearly 6 months and revealed an operation of staggering scope and sophistication that had operated virtually undetected for almost 3 years. When the final accounting was completed, investigators determined that 43 young women had died at the academy, not from natural causes as their death certificates claimed, but from systematic poisoning designed to eliminate witnesses and dispose of victims who had become too damaged to be profitable. The trial began in September of 1814 and lasted for 7 weeks, generating newspaper coverage throughout the United States and even in European publications that characterized it as evidence of the moral corruption that inevitably arose in democratic societies. Victoria Fairfax, maintaining her composure even in the face of overwhelming evidence, attempted to portray herself as a victim of circumstances who had been manipulated by male relatives and clients. But the testimony of survivors, combined with her own meticulously kept records, painted a picture of a woman who had conceived and orchestrated every aspect of the Academy's criminal operations. Bartholomew Fairfax adopted a different strategy, claiming that he had been conducting legitimate religious ceremonies that had been misinterpreted by witnesses who lacked proper theological education. His defense collapsed when investigators discovered that the religious rituals he described matched no known Christian doctrine and appeared to have been invented specifically to provide psychological cover for systematic sexual exploitation. Evangeline Fairfax proved to be the most tragic figure in the conspiracy. Medical examination revealed that she had been drugged consistently for more than a decade, rendering her mentally incompetent and transforming her into an unwitting accomplice in her family's crimes. Her musical performances during the exploitation sessions had been the product of careful conditioning rather than willing participation, and she retained almost no memory of the events she had helped facilitate. The network of prominent clients, who had patronized the academy faced varying fates depending on their social connections and political influence. Several judges and legislators were quietly forced to resign their positions and leave Massachusetts, while others managed to avoid prosecution through strategic bribes and destroyed evidence. But the scandal destroyed the careers of at least a dozen men who had believed their wealth and status would protect them from consequences. Dr. Edmund Fairfax received a sentence of 20 years in prison for his role in falsifying death certificates and providing medical support for the Academy's operations. His conviction effectively ended the medical careers of several other physicians who had been involved in similar schemes throughout New England, sending a clear message that professional credentials would not shield criminals from prosecution. Victoria and Bartholomew Fairfax were sentenced to death by hanging, making Victoria the first woman executed in Massachusetts for crimes other than witchcraft. The sentences were carried out on November 15, 1814, before a crowd of more than 2,000 spectators who had traveled from throughout New England to witness the end of what newspapers had dubbed the most depraved criminal conspiracy in American history. Margaret Sullivan's courage in exposing the Academy's crimes made her a celebrity throughout the United States, with newspapers portraying her as a symbol of virtue triumphing over corruption. She used her newfound fame to advocate for improved protection of orphaned and impoverished children, eventually establishing her own legitimate educational institution in Boston that provided free schooling for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. Her academy operated successfully for more than 30 years and educated hundreds of young women who went on to become teachers, nurses, and activists in their own right. Constance Hartwell returned to Boston after the trial and married a fellow teacher who shared her commitment to educational reform. Together, they founded a progressive school that emphasized critical thinking and independent inquiry rather than rote memorization and blind obedience to authority. Constance spent the rest of her life working to ensure that educational institutions would be subject to regular oversight and inspection, preventing the kind of isolated abuse that had flourished at St. Mary's Academy. The Academy building itself was demolished in 1815, with the materials sold to help compensate the families of victims. The site remained vacant for more than 20 years before being developed into a public park dedicated to the memory of the girls who had died there. A simple monument, erected through donations from throughout New England, bears the names of all 43 victims along with an inscription that reads, "They were forgotten by the world, but not by history." The most lasting impact of the St. Mary's Academy scandal was the changes it prompted in how educational institutions were regulated and monitored. Massachusetts became the first state to require regular inspections of all schools, particularly those serving vulnerable populations, and to mandate that educational institutions maintain detailed records that were subject to official review. These reforms were gradually adopted by other states and became the foundation for modern educational oversight systems. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was the precedent it established that wealth, social position, and religious authority could not shield criminals from prosecution when sufficient evidence was presented by credible witnesses. The conviction of the Fairfax family and their prominent clients demonstrated that American justice, when properly functioning, could hold even the most powerful members of society accountable for their crimes. The story of St. Mary's Academy serves as a reminder of how easily institutions designed to protect the vulnerable can be corrupted by those who see weakness as an opportunity for exploitation. It shows us that evil often wears the mask of virtue, that respectability can be a cover for unspeakable crimes, and that the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for truth can ultimately triumph over systematic corruption. In the end, words of Margaret Sullivan, spoken during her testimony at the trial. They thought we were powerless because we were poor, because we were young, because we were alone. They thought they could use us and discard us without consequence because no one would believe our word against theirs. But they forgot that even the powerless can find power when they stand together for truth. Today, more than 2 centuries after these events, we still struggle with the same fundamental challenges: protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them, ensuring that institutions serve their stated purposes rather than hidden agendas, and maintaining the courage to speak truth to power, even when doing so requires enormous personal sacrifice. The girls who died at St. Mary's Academy were not forgotten by history, and their story continues to remind us that the price of allowing evil to flourish is always higher than the cost of confronting it. Their voices, silenced by their tormentors, but preserved in the testimony of survivors and the records of their suffering, still echo across the centuries with a simple but powerful message. Remember us. Learn from our sacrifice, and never again allow such horrors to be committed in the name of virtue, education, or faith. In remembering them, we honor not only their memory, but also our obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe that such systematic exploitation could happen today under the cover of respectability and religious authority? Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that go beyond the surface to explore the deeper questions about power, corruption, and justice. Hit that like button if this investigation into America's hidden past resonated with you, and subscribe to never miss stories that reveal the secrets others would prefer to keep buried. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our community of truth seekers values every perspective on these complex historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the past has lessons for those brave enough to listen.